A white woman lets a homeless black man take a shower in her house, but when she finds out who he is, she's left utterly shocked. On a frosty December night in the quiet town of Silver Pine, Margaret, a warm-hearted woman in her late 40s, was making her way back home after volunteering at the town's community library. As she walked through the dimly lit streets, she spotted a homeless black man sitting near the entrance of an abandoned bus station, huddled under a torn blanket. His name was Henry, and there was something in his posture and expression that resonated deeply with Margaret, reminding her of her late cousin who had once battled homelessness. Henry shivered visibly, his thin coat doing little against the cold. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before approaching him with a gentle smile. "Excuse me," she said softly. "It's freezing out here. Would you like to come inside for a hot meal and maybe warm up a bit?" Henry looked at her cautiously. He had grown used to being treated with suspicion or outright disdain, but Margaret's kindness felt genuine. He nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. That would mean a lot." Margaret led Henry to her modest two-bedroom house, nestled on the edge of town. As soon as they stepped inside, she offered him a warm shower and laid out clean clothes that had belonged to her late husband. While Henry freshened up, Margaret prepared a hearty meal of soup and freshly baked bread. Her home smelled inviting, and for the first time in years, Henry felt a flicker of hope. While Henry was still in the shower, Margaret decided to step out to the nearby grocery store to pick up a few extra supplies. When she returned, she was startled to see a police car parked outside her house. Her heart sank as she hurried to the door, where two officers were questioning Henry, who looked both frightened and confused. "Ma'am, is this man supposed to be here?" one of the officers asked, his tone firm but not hostile. Margaret drew herself up, her voice steady. "Yes, I invited him in. He's my guest." The officers exchanged glances before explaining that a concerned neighbor had reported a suspicious person entering her home. Margaret felt a pang of anger, but kept her composure. "There's no issue here," she said firmly. "He's with me." Realizing their mistake, the officers apologized and left, but Henry seemed shaken. Margaret sat down beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said. "You're safe here." After a long pause, Henry began to open up. He told her that he was a veteran who had served in the military for many years. However, after returning from his last deployment, he had been overwhelmed by trauma and depression. Unable to cope, he lost his job, his home, and eventually his family. Margaret listened intently, her heart aching for him. "You've been through so much," she said softly. "But you don't have to go through this alone anymore." Over the next few weeks, Margaret helped Henry take the first steps toward rebuilding his life. She reached out to a local veterans organization and found a counseling program that specialized in trauma recovery. She also helped him apply for jobs and gave him a room in her home to stay until he could get back on his feet. Slowly but surely, Henry began to regain his confidence. One evening, while sorting through some old belongings, Margaret found a faded photograph of her younger brother, Samuel. He had disappeared over a decade ago, and the pain of his absence still lingered. "This is my brother," she told Henry, her voice trembling as she handed him the photo. "I haven't seen him in years. Every time I help someone, I think of him." Henry stared at the picture, his expression suddenly shifting. "Margaret," he said slowly, "I think I've seen him before." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "What? Where?" Henry explained that he had once met someone who resembled Samuel at a homeless shelter in a neighboring city. The man had been looking for someone, though Henry couldn't recall much more. Margaret felt a surge of hope. "We have to find him," she said, her determination unshakable. Henry agreed to help, and together they began a search that would take them through shelters, soup kitchens, and hospitals. After weeks of searching, they finally received a lead from a shelter worker who recognized Samuel's photo. "He was here a few months ago," the worker said. "He's staying at the city hospital now. He's very ill." Margaret and Henry rushed to the hospital, where they found Samuel in a small room, frail but alive. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she knelt beside him. "Samuel, it's me. I've found you," she whispered. Samuel opened his eyes weakly, his voice a faint rasp. "Margaret, you found me." With Margaret's care, Samuel began to recover. Meanwhile, Henry, inspired by the love and support he had received, decided it was time to give back. He started volunteering at a local community center and eventually secured a job as a warehouse manager. But just as their lives seemed to stabilize, a shadow from Henry's past reemerged. One afternoon, while Margaret was at work, a man named Victor approached her at the library. His presence was intimidating, and his tone was sharp. "I know you've been helping Henry," he said. "Tell him to keep quiet about what he saw, or there will be consequences." Margaret's hands trembled, but she stood her ground. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said firmly. Victor smirked. "Just give him the message," he said before walking away. That evening, Margaret told Henry about the encounter. His face went pale. "Victor was my commanding officer," he explained. "I discovered he was involved in illegal activities, and when I tried to expose him, he ruined my life." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You're not alone in this. We'll face him together." With her encouragement, Henry went to the police and reported everything he knew about Victor's crimes. An investigation was launched, and soon Victor was arrested. During the trial, Henry testified about what he had uncovered, and Margaret's testimony further bolstered the case. After weeks of proceedings, Victor was found guilty and sentenced to prison. With Victor behind bars, life finally began to settle. Henry thrived in his new job, earning the respect of his co-workers, while Samuel continued his recovery. Margaret, inspired by their journey, decided to open a community center called Beacon of Hope to help others who had faced similar struggles. The center became a haven for the homeless and displaced, offering shelter, counseling, and job training. Henry took on a leadership role, mentoring veterans and sharing his story of resilience. Samuel found purpose in helping with the center's kitchen, and Margaret oversaw the day-to-day operations with tireless dedication. Years later, as they celebrated the center's 5th anniversary, Margaret reflected on how far they had come. "Who would have thought that one small act of kindness could lead to all this?" she said, smiling at Henry and Samuel. "You changed my life," Henry replied. "Now we're changing so many others." Their story became a testament to the power of compassion, proving that even the smallest gestures can transform lives. Together, they continued to inspire others, spreading hope and reminding the world that no one is ever beyond redemption.